room with no window, no light, in the foreground of which is a naked woman lying on her back on a bed of twigs and leaves. One leg is drawn up, her sex is quite visible and is open. But it's one of the things that you can't quite get out of your head.
Marcel didn't talk about it, and my mother didn't talk about it. I didn't even know. I knew there was a body involved, but I didn't know anything about the rest of it. Not a thing.
He never told me. I never permitted to penetrate the 2 or 3 rooms that compose the studio. And I was curious to know what in hell he was doing.
The heavy wooden doors in this gloomy room are part of a work of art. It's the final work of one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. The scene behind it has puzzled and intrigued public and critics alike for almost 30 years. Until recently, nobody has been able to understand its full significance or the personal drama that inspired this modern masterpiece. This is the extraordinary story of the mysterious artist who created it, Marcel Duchamp.
I'd almost make it my business sometimes to meet him on the staircase, to actually say hello to him. But he was not open. He was not too receptive. He had his preoccupations, reclusive in a sense. On the bottom of this little building, there's an ash can in which he deposited all the garbage. And I was curious to know what in hell he was doing, because there were piles of metals, glass, all kinds of gadgets of all sorts of descriptions put into the ash can. And I'd take at it piece by piece to examine it. And there were contraptions of an extraordinary sort.
I did have a little inkling that there was something very dusty and that kept falling apart, that he was working on, and that nobody knew about it. Actually, it was only just a passing remark of my mother's that she was trying to help him keep this together and put it together.
The work, called Étant donné, which means given in English, is an elaborate peep show of a nude, moulded in plaster and pigskin. It was built in a small studio on the top floor of a New York apartment building, with elements collected over a long period by Duchamp and his wife Teeny, who helped him to gather twigs and bricks for the construction. She was also with him on holiday in Spain, when he came across the wooden doors, which he brought back to use as the facade. Duchamp worked in secret on the Étant donné for 20 years. In accordance with his wishes, it was only revealed to the public after his death.
Even then, at the time he died in '68, it came as a terrible shock, and it was very upsetting and very annoying to a lot of people, and particularly this work, which seemed to many people to be a denial and a contradiction of everything he'd done before.
Marcel Duchamp made his name when he launched a series of shocking and witty assaults on the art world. He turned his back on 500 years of Western culture in a dramatic subversion of existing definitions of art. He was the father of conceptual art and was mythologized in his lifetime as the 20th century rebel who had tried to destroy the word art altogether.
I don't care about the word art because it's been so discredited and so forth.
But you in fact contributed to the discrediting, didn't you, quite deliberately?
Deliberately, yes. So I really want to get rid of it. There is a sort of unnecessary adoration of art today, which I find unnecessary. And I think, I don't know, but this is a difficult position because I've been in it all the time and still want to get rid of it, you see. And I cannot explain everything I do because I do things or people do things and don't know why they do it.
Duchamp was drawn to the art world as a child. He grew up in Normandy in northern France, the youngest son in a family of 6 children. His father was a local civil servant, his mother a withdrawn and distant figure in his otherwise happy childhood. He was introduced into the French art world by his older brothers Jacques and Raymond, one a painter, the other a distinguished sculptor. Marcel admired them both, and at a young age he had already decided to become an artist himself.
Well, this is the bec au air, and it's a gas lamp, which Duchamp drew when he was in school in the lycée in Rouen. And must have been 17, and it was a lamp fixture in his room. It must have kind of fascinated him, this image here of the gas light that came up. And he used it again in his very last piece, Étant donné.
Étant donné was the final stroke in a long career full of strange and startling works. But Duchamp's artistic journey started in a more traditional way. At first, he was a painter and embraced a variety of artistic styles, an inspired apprenticeship which Duchamp later referred to as his swimming lessons.
Into one style for a short period of time and then swam out of it just as easily as he got in. And he's just in and out because he's just wetting his palate in a sense, and he becomes bored with this style almost as soon as he becomes proficient.
This restless exploration of styles and influences concluded with his Cubist masterpiece, Nude Descending a Staircase.
His first famous work, the Nude Descending a Staircase, was looked upon at first by his fellow Cubists as a send-up of Cubism, because the Cubists were very serious about their subject matter, and they certainly did not think that the nude was the subject for a Cubist picture. And the idea of a nude descending a staircase, like a showgirl in a Busby Berkeley musical, struck a lot of them as a very offensive joke. And it was largely for that reason that he was asked to remove it from the Indépendance exhibition to which he had submitted it. He was very offended, particularly because it was his 2 brothers who were also artists, who were delegated to come and ask him either to change the title or to remove it from the exhibition, and he chose to remove it, and he never took part in any of their group activities after that. His natural course was not to belong to groups. He was a loner.
No, I never enjoyed being a part of a group. I've always wanted to make something of personal contribution to it, which is can only be done if you think by yourself and not follow the general rules of the group, you see.
Duchamp branched out on his own and came up with a revolutionary new kind of art which he called the ready-made. Everyday objects chosen by Duchamp and turned into works of art simply by adding his signature. From a snow shovel to a bicycle wheel, a glass bottle of Paris air to a defaced image of the Mona Lisa, his aim was to shock the public, outrage the art world, and mock the pretensions of the traditional artist.
You couldn't overlook a urinal on public display in an exhibition, because at that point you'd have to ask yourself, is this a work of art? You'd have to ask the central question that a ready-made forces you to ask. You could no longer just walk by it and pretend even to yourself that it wasn't art. Here it was in the middle of an exhibition, treated as a work of art.
My idea was to choose an object that wouldn't attract me either by its beauty or by its ugliness. To find a point of indifference in my looking at it, you see. Of course, you might say I'd find any number of those, but at the same time it's not so much, because it's hardly difficult. After a while, when you look at something, it becomes very interesting. You can even like it. And the minute I liked it, I would discard it.
Duchamp's cultivation of cool indifference and his reluctance to engage with his fellow artists was also reflected in his personal life. The American artist Beatrice Wood experienced this when she met him in 1916.
He was very detached in the finest sense, but we were immediately clicked. Something was said about drawing, and I said, "Oh, I can't draw, there's no room in my mother's house." And he said, "Come to my studio and draw," which I did. And we had a wonderful friendship. He said, "If I'm not in, I'll leave the key for you. And when you phone, if I'm busy, I'll tell you. But if you're not busy, you come." And of course it meant when he was busy that he had some nice lady taking his time, because then our relationship was platonic. We had a wonderful friendship because I put no pressure on him. There was beautiful understanding. I let him completely free. And he helped me over my conventional stupidities, let's say. I made this nude. Marcel said, "You have to put a soap on a tactical position, shop for it, and get the right color and right shape." So I did, and finally I got it, and he glued it on the painting. And there were very few ready-mades or things way out in those days. And at the exhibition, people would stand in front of it laughing, due to Marcel, his mischief.
Eventually, their friendship developed into an affair, during which she was fascinated and frustrated in equal measure by his approach to their relationship.
With this beautiful expression he had of detachment. He was like a Zen priest. And he was very much like that. He was not given emotionally to anger or love. He said sex and love are two different things. He said all the time, cela n'a pas d'importance.
It's not important.
He said it continually, particularly if I was in any way emotional about either my relationship with him or someone else. It wasn't important, yes.
Duchamp's emotional detachment was a source of frustration to the many women who fell in love with him. The freedom of his single status was of huge importance to him, and for much of his life he was known as the King of the Bachelors. His inability to combine sexual and emotional involvement was a central theme in one of his most important works, a huge etching in glass, on which he worked painstakingly for 8 years, starting in 1915. Enigmatically named "The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors," even, it is also known as the large glass. The bride of the title is represented in the upper half of the glass as a combination of abstract mechanical parts and a floating cloud. Below her, 9 equally abstract bachelors seek to be united with her, but are locked in an endless cycle of frustration.
The extraordinary thing about the large glass for me is that it is evident that he was trying to do something that was completely novel. It was as though it wasn't a question of doing something novel in that it was a different kind of story, a different kind of narrative, a different way of painting, but it's as though it's another kind of art. It's to say, if art didn't exist, what would art be like? And then starting from that far down. And during this process of starting from scratch, he even gets to the point of saying, we don't need eyes. You know, the retina is not the thing that makes artists. It's the mind that makes the artist.
The glass was broken in transit to an exhibition in 1926. How did you feel when it was broken?
Nothing. Not much, at least. I was, well, no, I was not, because I'm fatalist, maybe, enough to take anything as it comes along. And fortunately, a little later, when I look at the brakes, I love the brakes. The brakes take a similar direction in the two panes. So when you put them on top of one another, they seem to continue the same breaks, as though I had done it in purpose.
Marcel's place that he arrived at was so different that it's no surprise that it should be so little understood. I felt that he had spent his youth trying to get to a different place, something that would separate him from and free him from the pressures and the goings-on that people do in groups. So he ended up being a solitary researcher following this path that led him, among other places, to the large glass. I remember when he told me, we were talking about it, and I had already in my mind the image of this big plate of glass in his 14th Street studio. And he told me that as he was working on it, he said, you see, I wasn't working on a work of art. I was just making it because I wanted to make it. And partially it's true. He was simply making it because of his joy in putting together this strange story, growing in him and becoming an answer to what he wanted to say.
Duchamp published a series of notes to accompany and explain the large glass. They are often as elusive as the work itself, but they offer clues about its personal significance to him.
And if you look at Duchamp's notes, there is a tiny little drawing of the large glass where you can see the bride just vaguely sketched at the top. And rather than write out the entire word marié, he writes M-A-R period. And to define the bachelors below, there was very little space on the page. He writes C-E-L and then the rest of the word célibataire. But of course, if you use the two abbreviations of marié and célibataire, you get Marcel. So you could, I suppose, see the entire large glass as a kind of autobiographical machine, where Duchamp in that context represents the bachelor in quest of his bride. The theme of sexual frustration that is part and parcel of the large glass exists just as well in the Étant Donné. In the case of the Étant Donné, you are a bachelor standing on one side of the door. You're looking into these two little peepholes, and you cannot attain a full and satisfying view of this figure. The bachelor cannot attain full and satisfying union with his bride.
In 1927, Duchamp astonished his friends and colleagues when he announced that he had decided to get married. His bride was Lydie Sarrazin Levasseur, the daughter of a wealthy automobile manufacturer.
When Duchamp married for the first time, he made it a point to write to all of his friends to explain why he got married and what the context was. He didn't explain all of the details of it, but he made it clear that he married a woman who was completely independent financially. He wanted to make that clear to them, that he had not entered into a union with someone in the traditional way where he would have to be obligated to her, and he wasn't on any level. She was wealthy enough and had her own income from her parents, and in fact the marriage didn't last but more than 6 months.
This about turn in his private life was matched by a rumor that he had given up art for good and taken up a new career.
He said his great ambition now was to become a professional chess player. He had played chess as a child, always loved it, and in the 20s he really set out to become a master. He went into training. He began entering tournaments. He played against most of the greatest players of his era and did surprisingly well for someone who took it up fairly late in life.
Okay. If I check there, you go back. Is that correct or not?
Check.
Yeah, he used to be a member here.
He used to live in this block, in the other side.
This is a famous block. And number 50 was a meeting ground for famous artists.
He was a very important artist.
Oh yeah, he was one of the great ones. But he loved chess more than anything. He was very addicted to chess. Yeah. But he used to love chess more than his married life. You know what his wife did once? Have you no idea? She was so annoyed at his thinking of chess all the time, that when he was sleeping, she took all his pieces and glued them down. You get it? She glued down the pieces so the fellow couldn't play it.
A game of chess can be artistic, decidedly, because it's a visual form of movements. The bishop takes the bishop, the pawn moves, and so forth. In other words, when you look at a game of chess, you don't look at a game of chess as a visual, static thing. There's nothing beautiful in the sight of a chess game in progress. But when you play the game, the different movements, the succession of different movements, has a beauty of its own.
On the outside of things, it did look as though he had not only abandoned painting, but his entire artistic career for another. I doubt very much that he was the creator of this myth, because He always said that he would continue to paint if he could come up with another idea for something new. He just was not interested in repeating himself and doing the same old thing over and over again just to become more and more famous and to become part of this system that made artists both rich and famous. He was seeking an alternative, but he never totally abandoned his interest in art.
During the next 20 years, Duchamp maintained his links with the art world through friends like fellow artist and chess player Man Ray. They appeared together in an early surrealist film. He also worked as an art dealer and was frequently invited to help in the organization of exhibitions. On one occasion, invited to create a provocative installation at a surrealist show, he festooned the gallery and all the work in it with a mile of string, which almost obscured the exhibits. Still at odds with the formality of the art world, he also arranged a characteristically mischievous surprise for the opening night.
One day, when I was 10 years old, my mother came and said, Marcel Duchamp is doing an installation, surrealist installation, and he wants you to play ball at that. And of course I was delighted. I said, oh, I'll get some school friends who love to play ball. So there were 6 of us who showed up at the surrealist installation. Duchamp never came, but he had given us very clear instructions. He said, now, you're to play ball, but don't talk to anybody. And if they try to throw you out, you're just to say, Marcel Duchamp said we should play.
Duchamp remained as a mischievous presence on the art scene for the rest of his life. But even though his art was exhibited all over the world, everyone assumed that he had stopped creating new work.
The warehouse of the Tate Gallery. The Dubuffet canvases go out, and a strange assembly of objects and paintings come in. Every piece of work that Duchamp's ever done is here. Duchamp ceased from formal artistic activity in 1923, and yet no artist working today can afford to ignore his ideas. His work shows the dilemma of modern art. It shows a crisis, a stop, and a series of fresh starts.
In 1966, when the British artist Richard Hamilton organised a Duchamp retrospective, his replica of the large glass, the original being too fragile to be moved, was described as the last major work Duchamp had ever produced. The secret of his real final work, the Éton Donné, seemed safe. Then a small package arrived at the gallery, just before the exhibition opened. It had been sent from Brazil by a woman called Maria Martins.
It arrived in a package which was newspaper and string, and I cut all the string off and unwrapped it, and inside it was this small painting, a small picture of something which I'd never seen before. The reason I was so excited by it was that I'd never heard mention of this, it had never been reproduced anywhere, and it was a figure, a tiny model. And when Duchamp came to visit the exhibition just before the opening, he walked around with me, and when we came to that, he was deeply shocked. I mean, obviously, he said, where did you get this? And I said, we got it from Maria Martins. And he said, it's pity or something. And I said, what is it? And he clammed up, he wouldn't say anything, and obviously was irritated. And I'd never experienced anything like this from him before, so I was a little worried. I couldn't figure out what was going on.
We now know that the small nude was an early study for the Éton Donné. Duchamp had given it as a gift to Maria Martins, the wife of the Brazilian ambassador to the United States, who he had met in New York in the early 1940s.
My mother and Marcel Duchamp were the most different people you could imagine. If you had met them at that time and somebody had asked you, well, do you think, they will get along, you would say absolutely not. They have absolutely nothing in common. Because Marcel was, on the outside at least, was a very cold intellectual, as I say, very much of a voyeur. He didn't participate too much in things. And whereas my mother was absolutely the contrary. And she was passionate about everything, and she loved violently and hated violently, and she would get very enthusiastic about things, you see, which Marcel would not at all be enthusiastic about anything. You see. So I think he was fascinated by this lady who came from the tropics. She believed in getting her own way. She could cry beautifully with the diamond tears and never get a red nose or puffy eyes. And then when she got her own way, she would smile. So she was quite a lady.
Maria's life was divided between the diplomatic world of Washington and a more bohemian life in New York, where she mixed with leading avant-garde artists like André Breton, Piet Mondrian, and Duchamp himself.
When Marcel and when all the other friends would come, you see, there would be a sort of a open house perpetually, every day at about 6 o'clock. People would come and have drinks. They used to drink dry martinis. And everybody who was in New York would come, you see. Of course, she gave marvelous parties, mixing artists, intellectuals, political people, beautiful people, and somehow or other it always turned out all right. People were relaxed and had a good time. Well, I think he was absolutely fascinated by her. I don't think he'd met anybody quite like her. Slowly she became fascinated by him because he was a fascinating person. Besides, he was a challenge, wasn't he? And Mother loved challenges.
You think she fell in love with him?
Oh, I think she probably did, yes. I think she was probably very much in love with him.
Maria Martins and Duchamp had a passionate affair. He made a sketch of her in 1947, which he called Étant donné Maria, confirming that Maria Martins was the model for the nude and suggesting that she was the inspiration for his final work.
My own feeling is that this relationship really opened him up emotionally in ways that had not happened before. That he was not able to maintain that kind of detachment with her. It does even seem possible to me that what her daughter said is true, that Maria was a large factor in getting him to start working again on a major project.
Maria Martins was an accomplished artist herself. When she met Duchamp, she was making her name as a classical sculptor. One of her early bronzes, a nude representing a legendary Amazonian temptress called Yara, had already been prominently installed in the sculpture garden of the Philadelphia Museum of Art.
When she did Yara, she was still influenced by the Amazon, by the tropics. But then when she began seeing all these surrealist artists, her great intelligence started coming out, you see. And so then she did things, like that sculpture over there, you know, where there is this idea of the woman who wants to fly, who wants to dream, but at the same time she's held down by the snake, who represents her duties as a woman, her sexuality. Her feet are on the ground, but her head are wings.
Duchamp encouraged the development of Maria's career as a sculptor, spending many hours in her studio and helping to organize exhibitions of her increasingly surrealist work. As their love affair continued, Duchamp was secretly developing the étant donné. As far as the art world was concerned, he was now engaged only in supervising the assembly of the boîte en valise, a box of miniature reproductions of his earlier successes.
This is the boîte en valise, which Duchamp worked on for many, many years, also called the Portable Museum, which Duchamp made with 69 reproductions of his works at that time. And I'm going to deploy it very slowly so that you can see. This is the Bachelor's, which is the glass, which is the study for the large glass, which he took great, great pains to reproduce with its cracks. The cracks that had been made when it broke, coming back from its first exhibition in Brooklyn. This is the present which he gave to his collector, Walter Arensberg. It contains Air of Paris. And this is the typewriter cover, Pliant de Voyage, which is a ready-made, and which has its little Underwood label on it. And this is the little fountain.
Duchamp personally made 20 deluxe versions of the box for his friends. Many of them were assembled in Maria's studio at the height of their affair, and each of them contained a personalized original work.
The original work of art that was in the box that he gave to Maria Martins was a very strange-looking, amoeba-like abstract drawing. And for years and years, nobody had the slightest idea what it was. They didn't even know what the medium was. And this work was eventually, not long ago, was presented to the FBI laboratories in Houston, where it was on temporary exhibition. And the FBI laboratories concluded from chemical analysis that the material used was seminal fluid. And so here again, with Maria, we have a very earthy, erotic design.
In the summer of 1948, Maria left New York to join her husband at a new diplomatic post in Paris. Duchamp was devastated and started writing a series of despairing letters to her.
These letters to Maria Martins are letters where he actually pours his heart out. He is very much in love with her and frustrated by the fact that he cannot secure a relationship with her. And this frustration is expressed in virtually every one of the letters of this exchange.
As the months and years go by, he wonders what has happened to the dreams they shared. He also refers to their secret, the étant donné, and reveals that he is working 8 hours a day on the nude, which he describes as Our Lady of Desires. The hours not dedicated to her through his work are described as hours of suffering and loneliness. He is desperate to be reunited with her.
But he definitely wanted Mother to leave everything and rent a studio in front of his down on 14th Street and go on creating while he watched. And this was definitely an idea. He dreamt of that and he wrote about that. But that's very much my mother. My mother had her feet on the ground, and she knew very well that you can't, there are certain things you just can't do. You would ruin, you'd break the spell, you would ruin something beautiful if you went too far. So you had to stop flying and come back. And that's what she did. And tried and dreamt for a while that she would really leave all the rest, but then I think he realized that it was not to be.
They met once more in 1951, when he reluctantly accepted that their love affair was over. He later wrote, "I accept the situation as it is, and no longer hope for a miracle. I feel happy when I think of you." It was at this point that Duchamp began to build the installation in which the nude is now enclosed in the Étendonnais. It was built in the room next to his, the same room in which he had once hoped that Maria could be persuaded to make her home.
I think he probably learned to love and had to feel pain and because of her, and I think perhaps that was the great gift, and perhaps that's why he ended up by being somebody who was happy, because he certainly was very happy at the end of his life with Teenie, and I think she realized that there was a certain amount of gratitude.
Duchamp had mixed in the same circles as Teenie Matisse for years, but they now started getting to know each other better, and their friendship developed into an affair. Her son, Paul, first met Duchamp one Christmas at Teenie's house in the country.
It was a very low-ceilinged room with beams across the top, and hanging from one of the beams, upside down, was a Christmas tree. The usual Christmas tree, except that it was completely upside down. And Marcel's explanation was, you see, it leaves more room for presents underneath. Well, he was very quiet. He was very cool, as they say today. There was absolutely nothing as if this is our first meeting, or as if he had to make an impression on me, being the suitor of my mother, so to speak. It was as if we had always been there, and there was nothing new whatsoever about the situation. And he rather liked that approach to life.
Duchamp and Teenie were married in 1954. He was 67 years old. During their long and happy marriage, he continued the secret development of the Étendonnais with the help of his wife.
I think it was important to him to be able to work quietly without any kind of outside pressure or anybody, because from version to version it was terribly difficult to actually make, because he was experimenting and he knew how he wanted it to turn out, but there were so many elements, and it took him a long time to elaborate it because of the conditions, the heat when they went away in the summer, the body, which was put away in a closet and kind of wrapped up, would crack. Or, you know, he had several accidents with it, so he had to begin again, and it was a long process to actually assemble this vision that he wanted.
Duchamp's notes reveal that he changed the hair color of the nude at a late stage in its development. It is now the same color as Teeny's. The hand holding the gaslight was also remade, using her hand as a model.
Before it was finished, Duchamp lost his studio on 14th Street, where he'd been for 23 years. He had to move out. The building changed hands, and he was advised to move out. He transported the nearly finished work to another small studio a few blocks away. He carried most of the materials there himself, walking up several flights of stairs each way. Teeny said later it was just amazing that on all of those trips, which were in the village, in Greenwich Village, he never bumped into anybody. He said, "What are you carrying?" But apparently he never did. And she said a mover had to help him just once with the larger elements. But he transported the whole work and reassembled it in this new studio.
Despite the fact that he didn't seem to be producing anything new, his reputation continued to grow as his ideas were taken up by artists all over the world. This had been helped by the opening of a permanent exhibition of a large collection of his work in the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1954. He supervised the installation himself, and his careful positioning of the large glass revealed that he hadn't forgotten Maria Martins. He insisted that a new window be constructed directly behind it, creating a view onto Maria's bronze nude Yara, then on display in the sculpture garden below. After Duchamp's death in 1968, the Étang Donné was rebuilt, in accordance with his wishes, in a small room next to the gallery in which the large glass is still on display. Taken together, his large glass, incorporating the view onto Maria's Yara, and the Étang Donné, with its limited view of his own Lady of Desires, create a new and intriguing insight into the art and life of the 20th century's most mysterious artist.